It's interesting to me to hear the language. We talked yesterday about postmodernism and all those kinds of things about the millennials. And although Stan didn't use that kind of language, you hear it coming through in a more practical setting to partner with millennials, to have a sense of community. One of the big words I hear over and over again is authenticity, that you have to be authentic with them so they know that you're being real about what your intentions are, about the relationship, about all those things. And doing that in a classroom setting can be a challenge because you have a goal, you're trying to get a certain amount of information out, you're trying to make sure they get the gist of what you're trying to communicate. And so building that relational component, at least for me, can be a challenge in that environment. And so maybe you can speak a little bit to that, how that's working for you guys, and if anyone else has anything else, we'll go from there.
Well, again, in terms of trying to do that in an online class setting, I don't know how you do it. If you're doing a seminar, doing an actual classroom teaching, I mean, I think for me, it was said yesterday, using storytelling. Most, what I've found, next generation, they can really relate to your honest, vulnerable stories. I was, when I first started some, Bible school training, I was taught that if you become a pastor, if you become a spiritual leader, the last thing you want to do is tell people what you're really like. I mean, you have to separate out your ministerial life from your home life. And you can't really confide in people. You can't really be honest with your congregation about your struggles or issues in life. Well, again, I think maybe that was decent advice for the 60s, 70s, even 80s, but that doesn't work with this generation. They really want to know, are you human? And so being human, I think, helps to create, a healthy dialogue in terms of your teaching. So I use a lot of humor. I use a lot of stories from my family. I came from a highly dysfunctional family, which I've used as fodder for all kinds of ministry. I have permission to tell the stories of my mom and dad, which is, was good. Now my mom's in heaven, so she doesn't care anymore. But, I've got permission to talk about how crazy my family was. And that kind of helps to connect with students. They're very, very interested in hearing that, you mean you're not perfect? Because aren't you the great man? No. There ain't no great man of God. There's only men and women who serve a great God. God is the one that's great. So, I think that's part of it. You humanize it by sharing your own life, sharing your own stories. I don't share about my personal struggles with, Dr. Tim, but those things are, some things you have to keep to yourself. But the other stuff, I'm, just trying to open up and share and actually communicate life with them. So.
Yes, we're overcoming, praise God. Oh. So, any other comments or questions about this topic that you'd like to address? Why is flexibility so important for millennials?
Oh. For me, it's just that I've found that because they're not great necessarily at time management or any other kind of management, that you have to be flexible if you're going to get maximum output from them. So what the goal is, we have set office hours, but our set office hours are make sure you get your job done, basically. So if you come in at noon, we don't care if you work till 8 at night as long as you get your job done. That's what works for them better because of the way that they organize their life. So I think it just works better for them. At least that's been my experience. So I don't know.
How do you set priorities for them in terms of flexibility?
I still have job descriptions. They're very specific. in terms of what's required of them. That doesn't change. And if they can't meet the job, we kill them. It's just. But before we kill them, we try and give them a chance to adjust, adapt, but then we kill them.
I've had a similar experience. A lot of my media staff members are millennials, and they would rather go to Starbucks together and bang out 16 hours of work and then take in a couple days off. And even though that sounded weird to me, it seems to work for them. Yeah. So
it's the mission that matters, not necessarily the method.
any other comments or questions that we want to entertain? Right here.
I concur 1,000% with what Dr. Stan said about the church-based model being the place where there's the relationships and the activation. You know, we've talked a lot about online content delivery and all those things, which we understand are absolutely necessary. But at the end of the day, there's a barrier between that screen and that individual. And so that's why the church-based campus is so apostolic. It's so fundamental to the relationship building. And I don't care whether you're talking about people in their 60s or 50s or 40s or 30s or 20s. That's still, I think, where the rubber meets the road is the church-based campus.
And I think that millennials buy into that as long as it's community and not just a structure. Yeah.
I don't want that.
Another question.
Excuse me for sounding like the age I am and the generation I'm from. All my grandchildren are millennials, and most of them are in church, thank God, but they're characteristic of some of the things you said. I mean, this is known in the corporate world everywhere. Simon Sinek has become a best-selling author talking about the millennials. But the thing the headache for me is, okay, well and good. You don't come in at a prescribed time. You don't leave at a prescribed time. As long as you get the work done, and I totally concur, I like that. But if they don't know how to handle that, that turns out to be a management nightmare back on me, and I don't like that. It puts more work on me. How do you get around that? In other words, your tech team wants to do this. Let's get real. You know, they're doing it within their structure of what they feel, and then what they call complete and what they call is time management. It turns into a management nightmare for me.
Go ahead. You have much more. Well, there is some truth to that. It's especially from the modern perspective. It's hard to see whether that's being effective, is being efficient, you're getting your money's worth. You know, there's all those questions that are management based that come into that. The only way I've found to try to get through that headache part of it is through relationship. And so what I try to do, it's not always efficient, but as a manager, I try to know what's really going on with them. Yeah. And so if there's something really going on with them, are they really getting done what we expected? It takes more monitoring than you would have expected from a regular employee, 9 to 5, who's doing a task and getting it done. And so there's a cost, and from our end of the cost as managers is more time on relationship, which does not come natural to me, frankly. I'm a task-oriented person, so I'd be much happier just setting this thing and you do this. But I found more effectiveness, if not efficiency maybe, but effectiveness comes from allowing some flexibility and building it around the relationship instead of building it around just the task management. But that's the cost, right?
I think it is worth the cost relationally, but we have to change, in many ways, our management style to a certain extent in order to fit that.
Just as a point of an idea, a practice. I don't hire young millennials. I hire mature millennials that are maybe they're married, they've got 1 or 2 kids, and all of a sudden you've just changed the dynamic. Hey, we just want to sleep in till, noon and go to Starbucks. Their world has turned upside down. You still get people that have some of the same connections, mindset with that world, but their time management has changed substantially. So for me, just from a practical perspective, I want to engage and train and equip young millennials, but I don't hire them for positions of responsibility where I have global people around the world depending on, the output of that. So that's just...
Can I interject really quick on that?
Sure.
Yeah, we want to make sure that you leaders don't play into the entitlement that we struggle with in our generation. So we definitely need structure, and we definitely need boundaries. So as much as the relationship is the ultimate value, there comes a time in a day when we get kicked out of the nest, so to speak, and it's painful. And that's the process that I'm in right now. I've been working under Dr. Jeff Victor for 8 years, and he's kicking me out of the nest right now. And there's a lot of painful growth taking place in me. But it's because there's a structure that I've needed all along that is finally, if you will, getting laid down. And I have to make the choice, can I handle that or not? Because if I can't, then I can just leave. And that's honestly the bottom line. And so you have to facilitate an environment where you're not playing into or enabling attitudes, fundamental attitudes that we as young millennials, or whatever point of the millennial we are, we can't be enabled, and we need to be disciplined, because many of us grew up in environments with no boundaries. Speaking for myself, I was raised by a single mom with 4 kids, and she did the best that she could, but to be honest, I kind of got to do whatever I wanted. And so as much as the flexibility is so appreciated, there's also this whole thing of, I'm the next leader of the Bible college, potentially, and there's younger people looking at me. So what example am I setting by showing up to work 10 minutes late every day? What example am I saying by calling in, every week, a day every week? Granted, I'm involved in other ministry things, and sometimes taking a day off is much needed, but there's an example that I'm leading. And so I think, just to affirm you all, we don't need to be enabled. We need structure. You don't need to accommodate us so much that we're not actually maturing into those future leaders who are really leading by example.
And I agree with that. We're not saying abandon all structure, but there's a component to being effective with them as millennials that we weren't used to, that takes a little extra time, a little extra relationship building, that they appreciate and respond to. And they'll pour their hearts out for you and give you everything they can if you were willing to do that. But I agree also that we didn't change our office hours. We didn't do all that. But we do have flexibility. If there's something going on, there's some special project, or we want to do this or that, we can make accommodation for that based on the relationship we've built and trust between us, partnering.
Do you think the electronic age has affected that some?
Electronic age has affected that, because people are used to being access to anything in the whole world instantly. And so that whole concept has changed the way, especially millennials, think about how things work. And so that's part of the issue, that they're dealing with, is they expect instant access. They expect you can do it at midnight, or you can do it at 8 in the morning, or you can do it at 3 in the afternoon. It's always available. And that comes into structures like work structures and things like that. That's how they feel about it. So helping them adjust to other kinds of structures can be a challenge, yeah. And I agree also with Randall. We're not always talking about hiring situations, but there's also classroom situations, and how to get kids to show up for a 9 o'clock class. Well, that can be a challenge because they don't think that way. They think, I could get this on demand, because that's how they think. It's like we talked about, nobody goes home to make a 6 o'clock program on TV. It's going to be on your DVR. It's going to be online. It's going to be somewhere else. It's always on demand. And that on-demand mentality that comes from the internet and other sources permeates their life. And so figuring out a way to bridge that so that they can fit within the general structure, but still accommodate that effectiveness that they can generate through those kinds of things. That's the balance. That's the challenge. Okay, so we're out of time for this session, and I wanted to hear from some millennials, since we've mostly heard from boomer voices so far. So we've established a panel for this session. So if the panel members would come, please. And what we've done is we've assembled a panel of millennials. And we want them to basically talk about their perspectives on equipping, activating, educating, all the kinds of things we've been talking about as a group. We're going to hear their perspective. And so each one of them is going to share briefly something they feel is pertinent, giving them their voice, and then we'll have a discussion time after they're finished sharing. Okay?
It's for the Holy Ghost.
Right. So this is my little song and dance while they're doing the technology adjustment in the back.
I guess it excuse it at all. Unless it's one of these.
No.
He said it's for the Holy Ghost. The Holy Ghost in the middle, then. Or if you guys want to just scoot down.
The seat for Elijah is being determined. So I'm going to go ahead and allow them to introduce themselves so we don't take extra time and they can start sharing right away. And so the expectation here is, a few minutes, 5 to 7 minutes or something like that you want to share your perspective. And then we'll come back around with questions that you can generate yourselves or that the audience will also generate. Okay?
To introduce myself, I'm Paul Lackey. I've been here as a part of the local church here in CI since I was about 6 or 7 years old. On staff kind of here with the church prophetic teams. My parents are one of the pastors and leaders over the prophetic training here at the local church. But travel a lot with the family ministry, travel a lot on my own. Very active, very much have the heart of what this ministry is that the Hammonds have been imparting for years and years and years. So I'm excited about today to kind of be able to talk with you guys. So we're going to introduce everybody to share, and I'm going to try my best because if you know enough about any of us that are at CI, we all seem to have the gift of gab. So somebody flagged me down at 5 minutes, but it's interesting for me. I've kind of been raised in a way that may be different than most other. I kind of consider myself millennial, but borderline Gen X, and maybe Joe can identify with that a little bit. I'm 35, but I seem to relate a little bit more with Gen Xers than millennials. But I've been raised a little bit differently. I've been raised here in the church, and in a prophetic and apostolic church. So my thinking might be different than most millennials. As a matter of fact, people ask me all the time, what denominations did you go through? And what I said, I've been in a prophetic church since I was 6 years old. I wasn't a part of Assemblies of God or anything like that. But kind of the passion and thrust of my life right now is about how to bring generations together for the overall purpose for the kingdom of God. Because the examples that I've watched all these years being here is, I think Bishop was a huge part of setting Apostles Tom and Jane in as pastors when they were, 24, 25, 26 years old, somewhere around there. Set them in at a very young age, so that's kind of been the thing around here is there's no junior Holy Spirit. Every generation, everyone has an active membership type ministry within the midst of the local church and even more broad. But as of recent, I think it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago that Barbara Yoder at one of the Watchman Intercessor conferences here got up and started talking and prophesying about generations. And she said, I really feel like there's a time coming where it's going to be the generations prophesying back to one another. So the younger ones were prophesying over the older generation, and in the generation before, and I use that word because when I say older generation, some people get upset. The generation before us began to prophesy down to the other generation. I remember that day, something just began to stir in my heart, saying, gosh, I've been focused in such a way. How do you begin to take a word like that by faith and begin to activate it and begin to apply that? So then right after that, God really began to speak to me about kind of what my life has been with my own natural father, of a demonstration of generations functioning in family ministry. I've traveled with him all over the world since I was 17 years old. So this is what began to stir in my heart, is asking God about how do you marry the generations? How do you deal with what the generation gap has kind of caused recently among the generations? So some of the wisdom, some of the things that God has kind of given me about this is specifically with the generation gap. I think, and this is personally, I know there's a lot of people in here a whole lot smarter than I am, but I think personally with the generation gap, one of the ways to defeat that is to just start caring about generations that are out there and start dialogue and start talking with people that are not even close to your own age. David and I were just in Austin, Texas, and I had several opportunities of people that were a whole lot older than I was to. Most of the time, it's a simple conversation, kind of in and out, and it's over very quick. I sat there and listened to what they cared about, what they've been through. And then in turn, the fact that I just sat there and listened, they wanted to know about me. They wanted to know details. So to me, the generation gap doesn't really affect me because I don't really operate by it. I don't really have any walls with anyone, no matter how old they are. But getting back to this, part of my passion right now is how do we marry the generations within the church and keep that generation gap out of the church? How do you take the moves of God